Do I look like, at all, like anybody that you might be expecting to show up next week? Santa. Yeah. That's why I grew this beard this year, because I wanted to look like Santa. And now I'm sick of looking like Santa. But you know what? That's just one of the things that happens to you when you get a little older. First you start believing in Santa, and then you start acting like Santa, and pretty soon you just look like Santa. That's what happens to you. That's the way it works. But you know, here's an interesting thing. I wanted to tell you some stories about Santa Claus that you might not know. Because what do you know about Santa Claus? Like, can you tell me something Santa Claus does? What's he do? He gives presents to kids. Yeah. And how does that look? What does it look like? Does he ride in something special? Yeah. With reindeer and a sleigh. And he comes from where? Yeah.
North Pole.
The North Pole. See, you know some stuff about Santa, don't you? And he dresses in red, and he wears a hat kind of like this, maybe. Yeah, you know some stuff about Santa. But did you know that Santa Claus was born about the year 280? This is the year 2022. He was born around the year 280. Yeah. Santa Claus really was born once. They didn't call him Santa Claus then. His parents called him Nicholas. And then, over time, some people began to see that he was a godly man, that he loved the Lord. And so they called him Saint Nicholas. And over time, with the way we, say things in our world, Saint Nicholas, Saint Nicholas, Saint Nicholas, Santa Claus, is how we got the name Santa Claus. That's where it came from. Saint Nicholas was born in a place in Europe on the Mediterranean Sea called Patera. And he was born to very wealthy parents. And because he was born to wealthy parents, he was very fortunate as a young boy. He got to study. And you know what he studied more than anything else? He studied the Bible. And his parents loved God with all their hearts. And so seeing godly parents made him love God with all his heart. And he made up his mind at a very young age he was going to serve God all the days of his life. One day when he was on his way to go to school with his teacher was accompanying him. And they came across a lady who had a shriveled hand. Her hand wouldn't work. It was just all stuck. And he couldn't imagine what it was like not to have two good hands. And she only had one good hand and one hand that wouldn't work, like a claw. But he found himself walking over to her. And he found himself as a boy praying for her. And he watched as God released her hand and it became new. He was a man of miracles, even as a young man. And as he got older and got ready to come out of school, he decided that he would go down and see where Jesus actually walked the earth. And so he got on a boat and he went to Jerusalem and saw what it was like in Jerusalem and walked in the places where his master Jesus walked because he wanted so much to be like Jesus. And as part of that trip, they were in the boat and a large storm arose. And the sailors thought they were all going to die. And one sailor, trying to keep the boat from going completely out of control, climbed up the mast of the ship, but the wind blew him and he came crashing down, hit the deck, and he died. But Nicholas, or as you know him today, Santa Claus, stood up and said to the waves and the wind, "Peace, be still." And they stopped. The sailors were so amazed. And then he walked over to the man who had fallen on the deck. And they said, "There's nothing you can do for him. He's dead." And he goes, "It's not true." And he prayed for him and he rose from the dead. See, St. Nicholas, or Santa Claus, was a miracle worker. As he got back home from that trip, he went to a place called Myra. And as his habit was, he got up very early in the morning to go pray. He didn't know that when he arrived at the big church that he was going to pray, that there were people there watching And they were watching because someone had been told by the Lord that the man who came that day to pray first was the man who was to become the bishop of Myra. And that day he walked in first. And they said, surely you are the one to be the bishop of Myra, because he was a man of miracles. And as he lived there in that town, many miracles took place. One of the most famous miracles was that there was a famine in the land and no one had any food. So St. Nicholas began to pray. And one day, very quickly, a bunch of ships came in. And he found out that on those ships, there was wheat enough to feed the whole city for a long time. But when he talked to the captain of the ship, the captain said, I can't give you any. And St. Nicholas said, why? He said, because all of this wheat has been paid for and is promised to another kingdom far from here. And we're only stopping here to get a few things, and then we have to take the wheat to the place where we've promised it. And if there's any missing, they'll kill us all. And St. Nicholas said, don't be afraid. Just give us a little wheat from every ship, just a little. And you'll have plenty when you get to where you're going. And so they did. They finally decided they would trust St. Nicholas because they had heard he was a man of miracles. And St. Nicholas took the wheat and began to give it out every day to the people of the city. And guess what? The wheat never ran out. Even though it was only a small amount, it continued to provide for the whole famine. Every day people were able to go to St. Nicholas and get wheat. Meanwhile, the men in the ships went to their destination, and when they arrived, they were surprised to find out that they had more wheat than when they had left. Because Nicholas was a man of miracles. The last thing I want to tell you about, the last story of St. Nicholas, isn't so much a miracle, but it gives us an example of something that we could do. You see, there was a man in St. Nicholas's town who didn't have any money. He had been rich, but he'd become poor. And he had 3 daughters. And Nicholas, who was born to wealthy parents, had a lot of money. And he was always careful to give his money to those in need. And he found out about this man with 3 daughters, and his 3 daughters had gotten grown up, and it was time for them to get married. But in the land that they lived in, you couldn't get married unless your dad gave some money to the family you were going into. It was called a dowry. And the man had no money for a dowry. And his 3 daughters, well, they were going to be sold into servitude. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't find husbands for them because he didn't have the money. St. Nicholas heard about it. This may help you understand why we do some things at Christmas today. When St. Nicholas heard about it, he decided that he would go toss some money. Some say he tossed it in the window, a bag of money. Some say he threw it down the chimney. And somehow, when he got it into the room, however he got it into the room, it bounced and landed in a stocking that had been hung by the fire to dry. And the first girl found it, and her father and her rejoiced, and they were able to pay her dowry, and she was able to be married. But there were 2 more daughters, and St. Nicholas knew this. So the next night, he did it again. He threw in another bag of gold, and the second daughter found it, and she rejoiced because she could now get married. Not a miracle, but still a wonderful thing because he helped with what he had, and he gave what he had to those who had need. And she was then able to be married. And the third daughter was then the only one left. And Nicholas knew about it, so the third night, he went to throw the money through the window or down the chimney or however he was doing. But the father caught him. But it was okay. He said, don't tell anybody. Of course, you know how that goes sometimes. Stories get out. And the story of Nicholas providing for the 3 girls became a famous story in that part of the world. And it began to spread. And it began to change. And it began to get bigger and bigger. And other people began to act like St. Nicholas. Other people began to be like St. Nicholas. And so over the years, it spread around the world until St. Nicholas became famous everywhere. And I want to encourage you. As you grow up, maybe you think you'd like to be somebody famous. I don't know who. I don't see anybody big enough to be LeBron James. There's some pretty ladies here. Maybe you could be stars on TV. But the most important thing that you can do is take what's been given to you and be like ancient Santa Claus and give to those around you and share with those who have a need. And you may not be famous in this world as St. Nicholas is or as Santa Claus is, but you will be famous in the hearts and minds of somebody. And those are my stories of Santa Claus. Stories that don't always get told, but stories you need to know, because Santa Claus, St. Nicholas, would want you to know those stories more than any other story, because he would want you to know Jesus. And Jesus was his inspiration to do all the things that he did. St. Nicholas was a Christian and a lover of God and a servant to all the people that he was around. And for that, we can be thankful. Do you think someday maybe you'd like to be like St. Nicholas? Well, trust me, you'll get to if you have any kids. Yes, you will. All right. Thank you again for coming and being my small audience today. Everybody give them another round as they go back to their seats. They did a good job today.